On the morning of December 16th, 1811, a church bell rang in Boston, Massachusetts. No one pulled the rope. The bell moved on its own, swinging faintly in a building over 1,000 miles from anything that could explain it. Sextons across New England would later report the same thing. Windows rattled, chandeliers swayed, and somewhere in the frontier wilderness of the Mississippi Valley, the ground had just done something no American had ever recorded before. Here's what should follow a disaster of that scale. A list. Buildings destroyed, lives lost, structures condemned. Every earthquake in history leaves that list behind. This one didn't. The New Madrid earthquakes of 1811 and 1812 are, by most seismological estimates, the most powerful earthquakes in the recorded history of the continental United States. 3 catastrophic shocks between December and February, centered near the small Mississippi River town of New Madrid, in what is now Missouri's Booth Heel. The numbers alone are staggering. Modern magnitude estimates for the largest event range as high as 8.0. For comparison, that's larger than the 1906 San Francisco earthquake that leveled a modern city. The Mississippi River itself responded. Ground subsidence created a temporary waterfall. Boats anchored on the river were reportedly stranded as the water level dropped, then found themselves pulled backward as the current briefly reversed, filling a new depression that exists today as Reelfoot Lake in Tennessee. And the shaking didn't stay local. It traveled through the ancient unbroken bedrock of the eastern half of the continent, as far as Canada, the Gulf Coast, and Washington, D.C., where President James Madison reportedly felt it inside the White House. This was not a regional disaster. This was a continental event. So where is the damage report? Here's where the story turns from spectacle to mystery. When you search for a building-by-building casualty list from the New Madrid earthquakes, the kind of documentation that exists for nearly every major disaster since, you find almost nothing. No comprehensive inventory of destroyed structures, no insurance claims, no formal survey of what stood before and what didn't stand after. Compare that to San Francisco in 1906. Within weeks, city assessors had catalogued thousands of destroyed buildings, block by block. Compare it to the Charleston earthquake of 1886, full architectural damage surveys published within the year. New Madrid, 1811. Part of the explanation is almost too simple. The region barely had buildings to lose. New Madrid itself had perhaps 400 residents. Most structures on this stretch of frontier were log cabins and timber frame trading posts, the kind of construction that flexes under seismic stress rather than collapsing into it, and the kind that, when it does fail, leaves nothing durable enough to survey decades later. There were no newspapers stationed in the Booth Heel, no insurance industry had reached the frontier, no territorial government had the infrastructure to send assessors into a swamp-choked floodplain in the dead of winter. So the absence of a record isn't necessarily a cover-up. It may simply be the absence of anyone whose job it was to write one down. But that explanation only accounts for part of the silence, because something does show up in the historical record of this region, just not where you'd expect it, and not in the years immediately following the quake, but in the 2 or 3 decades after. Settlement in the New Madrid seismic zone didn't stop after 1812. It restarted, and when it did, something changed. Land surveys and settler accounts from the 1820s and 1830s describe a Booth Heel landscape reshaped by the quakes. Sand blows, fissures, sunk lands, and altered river channels that made the original town site of New Madrid itself partially unusable. Much of it had literally slumped into the river. What follows is a documented pattern historians and geologists still study today: a wave of relocation. Families abandoned original land claims. New Madrid was effectively rebuilt on different grounds. And across the wider region, you can trace a shift in where and how people chose to build. moving construction away from the soft, liquefaction-prone riverbank soils that had failed so catastrophically toward firmer ground inland. That's the building appearance anomaly. Not new structures appearing from nowhere, but a traceable pattern of where structures stopped appearing and where they started appearing instead. A ghost outline of the earthquake, written not in a casualty list, but in a settlement map. It's a different kind of evidence than we're used to looking for. Not what fell, what people, a full generation later, still refused to rebuild on. Now, about that church bell in Boston. It's the detail every retelling of this story leads with, and it's very likely wrong. USGS seismologist Susan Huff has argued the bell-ringing accounts actually trace back to Charleston, South Carolina, specifically St. Philip's Church, and that over 2 centuries of retelling, Charleston quietly became Boston, possibly confused with Charlestown, Massachusetts, just across the river from Boston itself. It's a small correction, but it matters because it's the entire shape of this story in miniature, a real, almost unimaginably powerful event, and a record so thin that even our most famous detail about it may be a 200-year-old game of telephone. So what actually happened to the buildings of the New Madrid seismic zone in the winter of 1811? The honest answer is that we don't fully know, not because the earthquake was mysterious, but because the frontier that absorbed it kept almost no paper trail. What survives isn't a list of what broke. It's a slower, quieter record, a town that moved, a river that rerouted settlers as thoroughly as it rerouted itself, a landscape people spent a generation learning to read and build around differently. Every disaster leaves 2 records. One is written down at the time, the other is written into the ground and into the choices of the people who come after, and sometimes that second record is the only one that survives. The Mississippi still runs where the quake pushed it. The question is what else moved that we've simply stopped noticing.